Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Jane Austen and Company. We are just bringing everybody together now, and we're going to wait about 3 minutes before we start the production. If you would be so good as to say hello in the chat and let us know where you're joining from. We'll be happy to greet you. No one just yet. Maybe people are still logging on.
No, there are people coming in. You see it?
Oh, thank you, Deb.
Yeah. We have
Clicking on that button.
North Carolina, St. Paul.
Oh, Asheville, Chicago, Carborough,
Austen,
Western Mass, Atlanta. Hey, from Boston. Oh, Valley Forge.
Ellen Moody. Hi, Ellen.
Yeah. Virginia, Fairfax, California,
Springs,
Macon, Georgia.
Georgia.
Welcome.
Wisconsin.
Texas.
We're everywhere. Michigan.
Oh,
Toronto.
Canada. Welcome. New York City, Maine. Robin from California. Sheila from Wisconsin. Other folks from Michigan.
We could spend our time just talking about the weather with everybody, right?
Right. I think there's a variety.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe tending toward the cold and snowy.
Yes.
Oh, there's Pittsburgh. I'm just down the road in Murraysville, near Greensburg, just outside.
Minnesota.
Kansas City, Minnesota. Oh, Minnesota might win on the weather question.
Mm-hmm. Well, there is a Toronto. I don't know how. Well, they're actually that's further. Oh, it's Adelaide. It's hot and sunny there, like Gillian.
Our speaker this evening is joining us from sunny, warm Australia, where it is 10:30 in the morning.
Oh, in Sydney.
Oh, Sydney. There we go. There. Oregon.
14 inches of snow in Minnesota.
Oh, my heavens.
Fresh snow.
Heavens. All right, y'all. Well, the snow is piling up, and it is 5 minutes after the hour, so we'll get started here. Good evening, everyone. My name is Sarah Marsh, and I am joined tonight by my fellow co-hosts, Deb Barnum and Delicia Johnson. This is Delicia's first time as a co-host, but she has been involved with Jane Austen and Company for a while now. She runs all of the social media for Jane Austen and Company, as well as the Jane Austen Summer Program. Our technical directors for this series are Nadea Pugh and Maisie Ferguson. Going back to 2019, Jane Austen and Company has aimed to provide top-notch programming related to Jane Austen. Jane Austen and Company started as an in-person event at local libraries, but since the pandemic, our programs have been delivered primarily through virtual formats.
The series, you show the series, yeah. So tonight we continue our new series, Music and the Regency. We kicked things off 2 weeks ago with Jeff Nigro's talk on Georgian fangirls and the influence that Italian castrati had on Regency music in England. We have 3 more events scheduled for this spring, including tonight's featuring Gillian Dooley. All of our presentations will provide widely different perspectives on the subject of music in the Regency. Music making and music appreciation could be complicated, even contested activities during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. We will look at the aspects of public music and domestic music. and sometimes zeroing in on Jane Austen's own musical experience. Each presentation will include a musical delight. Tonight, Gillian Dooley will discuss music in Austen's life and work, including some of what she played and sang. Next, on March 20th, we'll hear from Catherine Libin, who will move outward to women and musical education during this period. And finally, on April 10th, Laura Klein will discuss the evolution of keyboard music during this period and consider the music that Austen was practicing when she was writing. The whole series, promises to be an exciting and entertaining one. You see the whole group now? So, Delicia, do you want to talk about the website?
Please visit our website to get more information about the entire slate of speakers for this series. Our website is janeaustenandco.org. In addition, I wanted to take a few minutes to advertise the 2025 Jane Austen Summer Program. As I'm sure you all know, 2025 is the 250th birthday of Jane Austen. And so JAS is celebrating the occasion with a special version of the Jane Austen Summer Program taking place in New Bern, North Carolina, with a theme of sensibility and domesticity. During our 4-day symposium, we will explore topics including medicine, birth, and domestic arts in Regency, England, and colonial North Carolina. We'll focus on Austen's first published novel, Sense and Sensibility, considering the birth of her career as a published writer, as well as taking a transatlantic look at the world into which she was born. Our website, janeaustensummer.org, contains information about registering, travel, and accommodations, and more. We traditionally host JAS in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, but thanks to a generous grant from North Carolina Humanities, we're able to take JAS on the road this summer to explore colonial connections to Austen in a unique way. New Bern is home to Tyrone Palace, where North Carolina's first governor had his mansion. The coastal location is perfect for exploring the relevance of the Navy and the sea to Austen's novels as well.
Delicia, thank you. And now I'm excited to introduce tonight's speaker, Gillian Dooley. She's an honorary associate professor in English at Flinders University, South Australia. She has published and presented internationally on various topics, including Jane Austen, often with an emphasis on music. She was co-convener of the Immortal Austen Conference in Adelaide in July of 2017. And as a singer, she has been curating and presenting programs of music from Austen's personal collection since 2007. In 2021, she completed a detailed index of each of the 500 to 600 items in the Austen music collections, digitized by University of Southampton. And her book, She Played and Sang Jane Austen in Music, was published by Manchester University Press in 2024.
So before Gillian begins her talk, our technical director, Nadaya, will explain how you can send in questions during and after Gillian's talk.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the YouTube stream. We're very excited to have you all here. If you'd like to leave comments or questions, we ask that you please post those in the sidebar. We'll collect those comments and questions throughout the presentation and then ask them for you in the Q&A at the end of the presentation. If you don't have a YouTube or Google account, you will need one of those to post there. But if you don't have one, that's perfectly okay as well. And you can just email info@janeaustenandco.org. We'll collect comments there as well and ask those for you. So please comment. Our speakers love to hear from you. And we love to hear what you say.
And now, without further ado, we present Gillian Dooley and her presentation, Jane Austen's Musical Life.
Hello everybody. I'm just so delighted to be here today, virtually, and it's so honoured to be part of this amazing lineup of speakers, all of whose work I know well, of course, before I even met them, and in the case of Laura Klein, she's now become a good friend and a co-musician. I mean, we've performed together at Jasna last year, for example. So this is really wonderful opportunity for me to talk a little bit more about Jane Austen's musical life. So the Austen family music books. The Austen family contained a small circle of musical women, including some of Jane Austen's nieces and sisters-in-law. Next slide, please. So this is the website of the Austen Family Music Book, a collection of these books. It's not complete yet, but we're sort of working on that. And so some of them are printed, some of them are handwritten. This is sheet music, including Jane Austen's own manuscript books, has come down to us via the family, various branches of the family. The music collection is now available to view on the Internet Archive, quite freely available. And I've indexed the collection, or what's on the archive so far, in detail at the University of Southampton Library Catalogue, where a lot of music study of her music has been done at University of Southampton. And of course, my book on She Played and Sang, Jane Austen and Music, came out last year, about a year ago. So next slide, please. Oh, there's my book. Okay. Next one. So Caroline Austen. So what Caroline Austen, I'm sure you probably know, was the younger daughter of James Austen, Jane's eldest brother, and his second wife, Mary, Mary née Lloyd. And uniquely among Jane's younger relatives, it seems, Caroline actively shared both Jane Austen's literary and musical pursuits. Caroline was writing stories by the age of 10, and like her siblings, she would send her stories to her aunt and receive kind encouragement and advice. But she was apparently the only musical one in that rectory at Steventon. In her reminiscences written towards the end of her life, she describes visiting in 1809, when she was 4 years old, visiting the mansion in Stoneleigh. Next slide, please. She particularly remembers her pleasure at being allowed to spend as much time as she liked playing an old spinet, old and uncared for, in the gallery, and she was happy to be left alone to make music without being teased or wanted in the parlour at the age of 4. That's wonderful. So next slide. She was only 12 when Austen died, but much of what we know directly about her musicianship, Jane's musicianship, relies on Caroline's memories, as well as letters Caroline received from her beloved aunt in her last years. Some of these memories are recorded in her brother James Edward Austen Leigh's memoir of 1870 to 71, and the correspondence and other materials surrounding its production, including her own memoir of her aunt, written in 1867. There is also interesting material in her own reminiscences, written about the same time, but not directly about Jane Austen, but about her own family and childhood memories. So on October the 30th, 1815, Jane Austen was staying with Henry, her brother, in London, and Caroline was staying with Grandmama and Cassandra at their home in Chawton. Caroline had sent one of her stories for her aunt to read. Austen wrote that she did not yet feel quite equal to taking up your manuscript, but promised to do so soon, meanwhile hoping that she was doing her piano practice. I trust you for taking care of my instrument and not letting it be ill-used in any respect. Do not allow anything to be put on it but what is very light. I hope you will try to make out some tune besides the Hermit. So the next slide, please. So there's The Hermit is probably the country dance of that title, which was published in 1788, and there's a little recording of it there if we could play that. So that was a authentic imitation of an 10-year-old playing the piano. I couldn't get Caroline to do it herself, so I just had a go. It was on my piano at home. It wasn't the square piano at Chawton Cottage, which is in the picture there. Austen ends that letter as claiming Caroline as a sister aunt, because her oldest sister, Anna's first child, had recently been born, and she said, "I have always maintained the importance of aunts as much as possible, and I am sure of your doing the same now." But so it's not known what brand of piano Austen owned when she lived at Chawton, but it would have been a square piano like this. These are the pianos of the time. The wooden-framed early instruments, they're much smaller and lighter than the modern upright piano, which has a heavy iron frame. These two people can pretty easily lift a domestic square piano of this period. The grand pianos were also much lighter and on a smaller scale than the concert grands of today. And I think there's another slide there, thanks. So you can see that's on the left, there's a grand piano from about 1800 and one of the big modern concert grands with a much bigger range, dynamic range, but also a range of notes. The historic instruments of the time, the 18th and early 19th centuries, are now commonly referred to by the term forte piano, although that's not the word Jane Austen used. She generally writes piano forte, 2 words, or often in the novels, just the instrument. The piano is so commonly associated with female musicians that further specifications are usually required. So the evidence suggests that there was no piano in the Steventon parsonage at the time when Caroline and her family lived there. So they took over, obviously James took over as the priest at Steventon after his father retired. So next slide, please. There we are, Steventon parsonage, sketched by Anna. And so that makes it all the more significant that Caroline was able to practice her scales and make out the Hermit on Jane's piano at Chawton. In February 1817, Austen replied to a letter from Caroline which conveyed great news about Mr. Digweed, Mr. Trimmer and grand piano forte. I wish it had been a small one, as then you might have pretended that Mr. D's rooms were too damp to be fit for it and offered to take charge of it at the parsonage. Mr. William Digweed lived in the Steventon Manor House at the time. And a month later, in what would be her last letter to Caroline, Austen wrote, "I wish you could practice your fingering oftener. Would it not be a good plan for you to go and live entirely at Mr. William Digweed's? He could not desire any other remuneration other than the pleasure of hearing you practice." So 50 years later, you can imagine losing an aunt like that. Terribly sad. 50 years later, in 1867, Caroline records her memories of standing by the pianoforte at at Chawton Cottage and hearing her Aunt Jane play and sometimes sing. Her account is frequently quoted, and I think it's on the next slide. Thank you. Aunt Jane began her day with music, for which I conclude she had a natural taste, as she thus kept it up, though she had no one to teach, and was never induced, as I have heard, to play in company, and none of her family cared much for it. I suppose that she might not trouble them. She chose her practising time before breakfast, when she could have the room to herself. She practised regularly every morning. She played very pretty tunes, I thought, and I liked to stand by her and listen to them. But the music, for I knew the books well in after years, would now be thought disgracefully easy. So a great deal of what's been assumed about Austen's music practice is based on this passage. The remark about none of the family caring much for music has been particularly influential, though references in Austen's letters suggest that Martha Lloyd was studying music during these years as well. And the idea of the music being disgracefully easy is an interesting one too. I wonder whether Caroline realised that Austen would have been improvising accompaniments from the bare outlines that appear on the pages of many of these music books that she knew so well in the later time, when music accompaniments, piano accompaniments, were much more usually composed and printed in full. So could we have a look at the next slide, please? So I'm not sure if you can make that out, but on the left there is an 18th century version of a melody with a bass line. So the two lines, there's just the melody and the bass line, and the one on the right, it's just the beginning of the same piece of music, but we've filled out the piano accompaniment with chords, and we've put the voice on a different line. So it's much more specific, and much easier for a modern pianist, a modern performer to just play from it rather than to have to think of something on the spot and improvise. And also the musical aesthetics of Austen's era were different from those of the later 18th century. Haydn, the most famous composer in the world at the time, who lived 1832 to 1809, despite the huge popularity of his songs in England, was criticised by contemporary critics and literary figures for the florid and bizarre effects in his canzonets. And the critic J.F. Reichardt wrote that a song should be simple in form and line. It should permit the unfettered use of a competent voice and allow the instrumental accompaniment, however indispensable, to act as a background in complete subordination to the vocal line, which is, of course, quite different to the aesthetics of Schubert's songs and so many of the wonderful songs of the 19th century that we've come to know. And also the earlier Baroque, Bach's music, Handel's music, it's very much a dialogue between the accompaniment and the voice in those songs. Anyway, in her reminiscences, Caroline doesn't mention her own musical education at all. Some of the comments in Austen's letters about practising her fingering might encourage us to believe that Austen was giving her lessons, but Caroline explicitly said that she had no one to teach. And in any case, there's touching testimony to Caroline's importance to Austen as a listener and a fellow musician in a postscript to the letter from the 23rd of January 1817. So next slide, please. The pianoforte often talks of you in various keys, tunes and expressions I allow, but be it lesson or country dance, sonata or waltz, you are really its constant theme. I wish you could come and see us as easily as Edward can. James Edward was then in his late teens and was a frequent visitor to Chawton, while Caroline, being not only young but also female, couldn't visit her aunts at Chawton as often as her older brother could. So let's have a look at Caroline's other aunt, Martha Lloyd. Next slide, please. Fanny, Edward's eldest daughter, so Caroline's cousin, undertook a commission for Martha Lloyd on a trip to London in September 1813. Jane wrote to Cassandra, "Fanny desires me to tell Martha," so Jane was in London, "Fanny desires me to tell Martha with her kind love that Birchall advised her there was no second set of hooks, lessons for beginners, and that by my advice she has therefore chosen a set by another composer. I thought she would rather have something than not." So, as I mentioned earlier, exchanges like this seem to contradict Caroline's assertion that nobody else in the household much cared for music. Next slide, please. It implies that Caroline was learning to play the piano and probably already had a copy of James Hook's first set of Guida di Musica, intended for beginners on the pianoforte or harpsichord. And music had been part of Martha's life since childhood. Julianne Guerra, in her wonderful book about Martha Lloyd's household book, writes that singing was part of the Lloyd home, and Martha and Eliza were remembered as having particularly good voices. And Martha was Caroline's aunt on her mother's side, of course, and Caroline relates her grandparents' inferred attitude to female accomplishments. If music had been desired, I suppose it wouldn't have been very easy to find an instructor. For singing, none was thought needful. So this is for the generation before Jane Austen. For singing, none was thought needful. If girls had good voices, they would sing like the birds, like by nature. So what would be the use of teaching them? Caroline remarks that she'd often heard old-fashioned people regret that such and such a one had a singing master. She sang so much better before. It would be interesting to know whether the Austens shared this opinion. There's reason to believe that Jane Austen had a piano teacher, but no one to my knowledge has ever mentioned a singing teacher. So music education, next slide, I think, thanks. Next one. I'm not sure we go. Music education is often mentioned in Austen's novels, though the details are not usually recorded. In the first chapter of Northanger Abbey, on the face of it the least musical of the novels, the brief musical education of the heroine, Catherine, is described. Next slide, thanks. Her mother wished her to learn the music, and Catherine was sure she should like it, for she was fond of tinkling the keys of the old forlorn spinet. So at 8 years old she began. She learnt a year and could not bear it, and Mrs. Morland, who did not insist on her daughter's being accomplished in spite of incapacity or distaste, allowed her to leave off. The day which dismissed the music master was one of the happiest of Catherine's life. The old forlorn spinet, which must have been sitting in the corner of the Morland family home, the parsonage at Fullerton in Wiltshire, brings to mind the spinet that Caroline discovered in the gallery at Stoneleigh in 1809, old and uncared for. Those instruments, which are basically small harpsichords, were already out of date and unfashionable by the time Austen wrote Northanger Abbey in the 1790s, and positively antiquated when Catherine encountered one in Stoneleigh. Indeed, in Emma, Mrs. Cole ruefully signals her sense of Jane Fairfax's deprivation before the mysterious piano arrives by saying that she, who is mistress of music, has not anything of the nature of an instrument, not even the pitifulest old spinet in the world to amuse herself with. Presumably when the narrator of Northanger Abbey writes that Catherine's mother wished her to learn music, this means learning to play the piano and perhaps some rudiments of music theory. But as a child, Catherine shirked her lessons whenever she could and hated confinement and cleanliness. And no doubt applying herself to serious piano practice was part of learning music that she could not bear, as well as perhaps the disapproval of a strict and unsympathetic music master. Catherine does, however, become more socialised as her teenage years passed, and the narrator announces, ironically, from 15 to 17, she was in training for a heroine, the kind who appears in books that were all story and no reflection. She learns lines from Shakespeare along with other poetic quotations. And next slide, please. And okay, thank you. So far, her improvement was sufficient, and in many other points, she came on exceedingly well. For though she could not write sonnets, she brought herself to read them. And though there seemed no chance of her throwing a whole party into raptures by a prelude on the pianoforte of her own composition, she could listen to other people's performance with very little fatigue. The clause about throwing a party into raptures by a prelude on the pianoforte capped by the rider of her own composition is a delicious and beautifully timed piece of prose. And it also might be the only time in all of Austen's novels when the idea of a woman composing music arises. Now, a few female composers are represented within Austen's music books. In her manuscript music, among her manuscript music rather than her printed music, only 3 appear, so maybe we could have the next slide, thanks. 2 of them are very famous historical figures, and the third is a complete unknown. Queen Marie Antoinette is said by some to have written the song Pauvre Jacques in collaboration with one of her companions, Marquise de Travernay. Opinions vary as to which wrote the words, in which the music, and whether indeed the attribution is correct. And Georgiana Cavendish, the Duchess of Devonshire, wrote the music of the song Silent Sorrow with words by Sheridan. There's a plaintive little dirge titled My Phillida by a Miss Mellish, about whom nothing is known. Looking beyond the Austen manuscripts, we find 4 other female composers among several hundred men whose work is included in the Austen music collections. But the contribution of women to music culture was overwhelmingly as performers and as listeners, both equally necessary, of course, to a thriving musical culture. Being able to listen to other people's performance with very little fatigue is a valuable attribute indeed. Now, the keyboard instruments were thought suitable for genteel women throughout the 18th century rather than flutes or violins, which John Essex wrote in 1722 were unbecoming the fair sex. It's interesting to note that these smaller instruments were more portable than pianos and harpsichords. So apart from the unsuitable qualities mentioned in female conduct literature at the time, these strictures also confine women's music making to a domestic and indoor setting. Next slide. The harp is a somewhat more portable than the piano, though not as easily carried as the flute or violin, and not to be played out of doors. In the later novels written of this particularly sort of concert harp, this type of harp, not the sort of Celtic folk harp we're talking about. In the later novels written and set in the 1810s, Mansfield Park, Emma and Persuasion, the harp appears as a supplement and sometimes a rival to the piano, as we know. So here we have a beautiful piece by Jean-Baptiste Krumpholz, played on a harp from 1813. If we can play that track, please. But the piano, next slide, thanks, is the instrument that Austen herself is associated with, of course. The piano had all but supplanted the harpsichord by the end of the 18th century. And apparently she loved to play for the amusement of her nephews and nieces when we have the pleasure of her company, as she wrote to Cassandra in 1808. In a letter to her brother, James Edward, of about 1870, Caroline Austen wrote that Jane Austen had nearly left off singing by the time I can recollect much about her for performance, but she remembered 3 songs. So next slide, thanks. The first, she gives a title, she gives a few words of each of these songs, all of which appear in the wider music family music collection, although only one of them is actually among her manuscripts. The first is titled by Austen in her manuscript Song from Burns, the only setting of Robert Burns among her manuscript. The second is Oh No, My Love No by Michael Kelly. The third is Que j'aime avoir les hirondelles or the romance from Florian, French novel by Florian called Estelle and Namorin. And then in a letter to James Edward, Caroline also quotes another letter she received from her cousin, Fulwer William Fowle, who wrote, I well remember her singing, and the yellow-haired laddie made an impression upon me, which more than half a century has no power to efface. Caroline's words, she had nearly left off singing. What do these songs share that when she was looking back on these novels, these songs that Austen was singing in this very late period of her life when she'd nearly left off singing? So musically, they're sort of harmonically straightforward, bright, usually all in bright major keys, typical of music of this period, not typical of that lovely harp piece, though. They all have very attractive melodies. None of them in the versions that survive have more than the sketchiest accompaniment, like as I was saying before. Austen wouldn't have needed a fully notated piano part because she could improvise while she was playing the piano and while she was singing. And her familiarity with the songs would have made that much easier to play for herself. Above all, what these songs require is to be sung with conviction and clarity of diction that comes with good vocal technique. Each one of them tells a story, and as Janice Brooks from Southampton University points out, they all treat the topic of fidelity within a different generic and stylistic framework. The yellow-haired laddie is a young Scottish man who's in danger of being forced to marry a woman he dislikes instead of the one he loves. And of course, this is a very common situation in songs of the time, but it's slightly unusual for a young man to be expressing these sentiments instead of a young woman in a similar situation. So could we have the next slide? And I think there's a recording. I can see in the comments someone's made commented that it's nice to hear instruments from Jane Austen's own day. It is wonderful indeed when we can use those instruments, and that's why I particularly love visiting Jane Austen's House Museum and playing the piano there. But in Adelaide, for some reason, we're very, very, it's very, very difficult to get pianos of Jane Austen's era. There are plenty of harpsichords from the 18th century, but it's very hard to find a piano of the time. So that was just a normal sort of ordinary modern upright piano in that recording. So the next song, next slide, the song from Burns. So Jane Austen's manuscript. This is her manuscript of this Robert Burns song. In this song, the singer is happily united with his Jane or Jean in the original poem, but it's changed to Jane in Jane Austen's version. And he's proudly congratulating himself on his Scottish freedom from the empty trappings of decadent foreign civilizations. So there's a recording of that there somewhere too, I think. I always sing that one unaccompanied because the accompaniment in Austen's manuscript is just so very, very sketchy that doesn't really quite work. So, and I haven't got her skill at improvising. So, but I'm sure there are accompaniments available for that. But that melody isn't really found. It's only really found in one other manuscript anywhere in the world, and so it's not like. It's not as if it's been published or that we can find a publication of it to copy from, to work from. So the next song, Que j'aime avoir les hirondelles, is sung by the shepherdess Estelle, who's about to be separated from her lover Neighbours and married to someone else. It's the old story. The song tells of the fate of a swallow who is by nature unfettered, and if captured and caged by a cruel child, and both the captured bird and her mate will die of sorrow at the loss of their love and their freedom. It was a popular lyric, and it was set by several composers, and it seems likely that the setting Austen knew was this one by Francois Devienne, which was in her cousin Eliza's, one of her printed music books that's also among the collection there. So we've got I think we've got a video of this one. there were last year when I was, or no, the year before, 2 years ago, when I was in at Chawton House, the big house up the hill from the cottage, and meeting Laura Klein, the pianist, for the first time. We were just rehearsing this song, and her husband kindly took a video of it. So I'm hoping that's what we can show. Yes, there we go. So that was amazing. I just met Laura about 10 minutes before we did that. So she's such an amazing pianist. And that was that piano is an old, well, it's not from Jane Austen's time. It's probably mid to late 19th century, I'd say. I'm not sure of the details. It's probably fairly easy to find out, the piano in Chawton House, but I hope to go back there later this year and do something there maybe. So the final one, the Oh No, My Love No, the next slide, thank you. So this comes from a farce by Thomas Dibdin called Of Age Tomorrow, adapted from a Kotzebue play. Now, if you know Mansfield Park, you'll know Kotzebue wrote the play that Lover's Vows, the controversial play Lover's Vows, is based on as well. So this one is called Der Wildfang, or it's called this. Of Age Tomorrow is the name of the play. And in the play, it's the servant Maria. It's an account of her words years earlier to her faithless swain as he departs. And she's saying, oh, I wish you weren't leaving, but I won't blame you for going if it gives pleasure to you. But I'd like you to remain faithful to me, please. And it's quite a biting piece of satirical writing, actually. Now, Jane saw this play with her niece Fanny and other family members in Southampton in September 1807. And the words, which has the song with words by Matthew Lewis rather than Thomas Dibdin, had been Matthew Monk Lewis, that is, had been such a success in the play that it was published separately in 1805, rebranded The Wife's Farewell, even though she wasn't a wife in the play, And it was paired with another song called The Husband's Return, where he comes back and says, well, yes, you know, I had a good time, but now I'm ready to come home. So, you know, stop frowning. It's quite hilarious, really, in a rather uncomfortable way. And in the play, the song is sort of almost an aside, a commentary on the action and part of the character development, but doesn't really have any bearing on the plot. Removed from this context and given the added weight of the word wife in the title, it gains significance, although it loses nothing of its satirical force. So can we listen to this one now, if you like to? So taken together, these four songs contain both humour and pathos, though not the broad comedy that appears elsewhere among Austen's manuscripts in songs like I Hae Laid a Herring in Salt, or Charles Dibdin's cheerful satire in The Joys of the Country and The Lucky Escape. In the Burns song and in The Wife's Farewell, the humour is much more in the way the sentiments are expressed. The music reinforces the point of view in both cases, with the most emphatic part of Burns' rhetoric in the higher part of the voice, in both cases. And the melody in the Wife's Farewell, a melody that kind of wheedles and cycles back to the phrase, "Oh no, my love, no." Learning the Kelly song and singing it to family and friends has given me insight into the biting irony beyond what I'd gathered from just reading the words on the page. The singer has to act the role of the woman who clearly knows her lover's intention but is determined not to put herself at a disadvantage by openly venting her anger. The pathos is more pronounced in the other two songs, where the comic element is absent. We don't discover the fate of the yellow-haired laddie. Will he be forced to marry the wrong woman? And the swallows depict the dire fate of the lovers forced to part without ironic overlay. The gender of the implied singer in two of these songs is indeterminate, since they are in the third person. The other two are both first-person accounts, one masculine and the other feminine. This isn't at all unusual among Austen's vocal music, that she would, not worry about whether she was singing in man's point of view or a woman's point of view. In his 1983 book, Robert Wallace he wrote this fascinating book in 1983 called Jane Austen and Mozart. And he lists the classical and neoclassical values of balance, equilibrium, proportion, symmetry, clarity, restraint, wit, and elegance as typical of the music that Austen played on her square piano. I would add that when performing her vocal music, she gave voice to an infinite range of subjective positions: feminine, masculine, sentimental, witty, happy, unhappy, defiant, submissive, proud, abject, petulant, and noble. The classical values that Wallace mentions are certainly characteristic of Austen's fiction, but so is the emotional range to be found in the songs. She played, but she also sang, and her voice was the instrument that stayed with her all her life, whether she used it or not. It's almost too obvious to say that a singer is her own instrument, but it's worth thinking about what that means. Automata were already in her lifetime being invented that could play instruments, including the piano after a fashion, but only a living being could sing. To hear singing in Austen's lifetime, for sound recording, you had to be in the presence of a human being. She played and sang. Much of the music collection was vocal music. That gives an idea of what she might have sung. And 50 years after her death, a trace of her voice remained in the memories of some of her surviving relatives and was recorded for posterity in Caroline's letters. On the face of it, most of the songs could be described as love songs, in the same way that her novels are sometimes regarded as romances. However, these love songs have the capacity to express a wide range of individual human emotions, and a singer is embodying those emotions each time she sings them. The practice of singing and feeling the drama of each scenario cannot, I believe, have failed to influence the singer when she sat at her desk to write, and the rhetoric of music flowed naturally into the musicality of her prose. Thank you very much.
Very nice. Unmute.
You would think after all these years, you would have it down. That was just so moving to hear, to hear the music in real time. And I think it really does speak to the way that music transcends history in ways that other art forms do not. And I was just wondering, to get the conversation started, if you could talk to us a little bit about what drew you to this element of Jane Austen's life and work.
Well, music and literature, I suppose, have always been sort of parallel passions in my life. I think I started singing when I sort of probably in my cot, in my cradle. Though maybe my mother didn't call it singing there. But also I tried, I was reading as soon as I could possibly hold a book. It was, and of course Jane Austen came to me quite early, reading at school, and I was reading Pride and Prejudice at school, and the teacher said something about say something about the characters in Pride and Prejudice and how she differentiates them. And I said, well, obviously Mary and Elizabeth play the piano. Mary and Elizabeth Bennet play the piano in such different ways. That's part of it, that shows something about their character. And the teacher said, no, that's just to do with the way she plays the piano. And I thought, no, I knew she was wrong. So 25 years later, I came and wrote an honours thesis on that very subject of music in the novels. And then I discovered the music collection. And then, gradually got to know got to be able to be familiar with the actual pieces of music, not just a list of them. And so, and then, you know, it just sort of naturally happened. So yeah,
it's just so extraordinary to have access to that dimension of her
absolutely
work.
Yeah.
We do have a question from Chapel Hill about the relationship between the musical culture of Jane Austen's time, her own participation in it, and the way that it inflects the novels. And I just taught Pride and Prejudice, and I just could not get over how funny it is in the scene where Lady Catherine is talking about, you know, if she had ever really learned.
Right.
I know.
It's just smashing. It's so good. Can you say more about
Yeah.
that scene or any of the ones you'd like to speak?
Well, I mean, there's just so much when you start looking at it. There's just so much to talk about. But that scene is so wonderful because she's saying, why haven't you all learnt? You know, you should have all learnt. And Elizabeth said, well, those of us who wished to didn't lack the masters. We were happy, you know. But you should have all learnt. And then a little bit later, she's just casually slips in that neither Lady Catherine nor her daughter ever learnt music.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, if I had, I would be a great proficient. It's just, you know,
and then she
slices it.
Yeah, then she invites Elizabeth to come play and says, "You can play on the instrument
in the housekeeper's room.
Yeah, you won't be in anyone's way, except that it's in her room." I'm just dying reading this. It's just lovely.
Yes,
it
that's
really
right.
is a kind of it's an index of all of this characterological development.
Yeah.
It reaches, you know, across the entire oeuvre, right? You see the characters developing.
Yeah.
With
and I think you know, it does help to know. I mean, of course, any kind of background does help to know. It does help to know the status of the harp at the time, for example. You know, that the harp really signified, and I think it's pretty obvious with Mary Crawford that the harp makes the fact that she plays the harp makes it different. And of course, in Emma, you know, Mrs. Elton says, "Oh, you should get your own. You should get your own room, isn't it, or something like that? You know, you should be able to eat with the family. But maybe if you played the harp, even perhaps without the harp, you can do that." She's just sort of so the harp is obviously a sort of status symbol at the time, and Jane didn't play the harp herself, so Jane Austen.
So we did have a question when you mentioned Matthew Lewis. Is that the famous monk Matthew Lewis? Same.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. Yes, so he wrote you know, a few plays. A lot of these sort of plays, they weren't operas as such. They were plays, but most plays had some music in them, you know, some songs in them. And, you know, so a lot of the plays that Jane, you know, that Jane and the family, you know, in the family, there were a lot of family theatricals throughout her life, with Fanny, with her own brothers and sisters when she was young, but later as well. And so, you know, the music would have been there, and sometimes there's music that's copied into her book, and you think, why would she copy those little bits of incidental music into her music book? She surely must have had a reason. They must have been going to play, you know, to put that play on at home, and she's written out the music so she can use it. And so I don't know.
I had another question. The Burns song, is that the only Burns song that are you know, in her manuscripts?
Yes, it is.
But it's interesting that the character, the woman, is named Jane.
Yes. Yeah. Well, the thing is, you know, that in, of course, Robert Burns's wife was Jean, and in the song, in the Burns poem, which is published, it's Jean in the last line of both verses.
Yeah.
But in Jane Austen's manuscript version, it's changed to Jane. Yeah. But then one other version has been found, another manuscript version from someone, a completely unrelated family. So a young woman in Cheshire or somewhere who didn't, had no connections with. So there's obviously a printed version somewhere that has now disappeared. This music was sheet music was so ephemeral at the time. It wasn't, there could have just been a few copies published, and it might still turn up in some old book somewhere that, there's so much musical activity, and I think what we have is only a fraction of what actually was happening. Yeah. And that's what's so wonderful about this music collections like this. There's so much music that we can sort of pull up and find that we'd never, like the composers I'd never heard of before. And now I think, some of them are now my favourite composers.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So here's a good one from Patricia. Do you want to pop that in, Sarah? Yes.
Oh goodness me. Well, I just sing the way I sing. So I mean, I have studied singing throughout my life, but I'm not an operatic singer or anything like that. I've been a choral singer a lot, so I don't particularly put on a special type of voice or singing for this repertoire any more than I do for anything else. But it's interesting. There was a lot of debate, I think, at the time there was a debate about Italian singing versus sort of English singing, or I think the Italian was very ornate. The Italian music tended to be very ornate and with lots of fast passages, and had to be quite virtuosic to do that sort of singing, that sort of Italian operatic singing, whereas the English mode was much more the sort of songs I sang today. It's really, really hard to answer that question, because of course we don't have recordings, and you say that somebody said, I think maybe it was James Edward, she said she had a sweet voice or something, and it was so it sounds as though it wasn't a big operatic kind of voice with lots of vibrato. It's more of a sort of straight tuned sort of simple voice, but there was also there was also a debate among singing teachers, singing manuals and that sort of thing at the time about using vibrato or not using vibrato, and I think that was the case with instrumentalists too. How much you do wobbly sort of singing rather than fairly straight on the note. So so it is a really interesting question, and it's a little bit unanswerable, I'm afraid.
Is there anything in the letters or any of the memoirs of why she gave up singing? I mean, if she was ill toward the end, I mean, obviously that did, but
well, I think that's she'd nearly left off singing. I think Caroline's talking about the very last, sort of last months of her life, really.
Right.
When you, because it does take physical effort to sing,
energy.
And one thing that's really struck me was she was a high soprano. I actually took some of those songs down a tone or so to sing them, and they still go reasonably high in the range. Her piano might have been tuned a little bit lower, so it mightn't have been quite so high as the modern piano's tuned. That's something that the musicians might understand. But yes, she it wasn't so much. just the sort of folk singing, because I mean there are a lot of folk songs, but that song from Burns and the Yellowhead Lady, they are Scottish folk songs,
Right.
but they have a very wide range. They're not like the sort of pop songs or modern folky songs, which are much sort of more in the middle of the vocal range or the lower part of the vocal range. Yeah, so it's an interesting question.
Here's one.
We don't think so. Apparently, we don't think so. There are some, there are some that are unattributed, and that I haven't been able to find the composers or even the lyric writers. There are just a few mysteries, but we don't think so. We've found the melodies of most of the tunes. There's a sonata in one of her manuscript books, which is also unattributed to any composer, but that's not unusual among her manuscripts, and nobody else has been able to find it. And the jury's out really about whether she composed this three movement sonata, which is a pretty big thing to do. Well, she might have, but on the whole, I would say, we probably not, and we really don't know. It's an interesting question about church music there.
Yeah, where's that one?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Well, that is interesting, Julia. That there's very, very little religious music in the collection. There's a couple of things. There's a hymn that she wrote. She copied out when she first moved to Bath by a chap who had been the organist at the Laura Street Chapel, and he had just died, actually quite young, I think, and so she wrote out this morning and evening hymn that he'd written, but we don't know what that might have meant. Why she would have copied that, and the Church of England tradition, the choir, the choral tradition, that was really in the cathedrals. The parish churches just had very little music. They hardly had. Very few of them had organs in those days. Music was just sort of not really a big thing in the parish churches at that time. There's a bit about this in my book, and why. So she wouldn't have probably had an opportunity to sing in a choir, which is a bit sad, really, when you think about it. It's such a wonderful thing for particularly young musicians to do. There is some ensemble music, but not a lot of what you might call hymns, and not a lot of kind of really sort of liturgical religious music.
Could you say something about the last chapter in your book is about Marianne and Willoughby, and based on a ballad about Lucy and Colin?
Yes.
Could you say something about that? That's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, I was learning this because when we did our Immortal Austen conference, which was for the bicentenary of her death, I decided to put on a concert as part of the conference called music to do with death in her collection. I found this ballad, this sort of multi-part sort of almost cantata thing called Colin and Lucy, and it's a highly melodramatic story about this spurned maiden who decides she's just going to die of love because her fiance is marrying someone else. So she goes off and says, okay, when I'm dead, take me to the wedding ceremony of the new, his new bride, and present me to him, and in my corpse, in its winding sheet, and it's quite, and of course they do that, and he's so struck with remorse and shame and everything that he dies. So then they're buried together, and that ends happily ever after. and at the time, when I was sort of learning this song, I just thought there's kind of the bones of Sense and Sensibility in there with Marianne and Willoughby, with the sort of scenes like the confrontation at the London party between Marianne and Willoughby, and the sickness. She gets sick, but then the contrasts are as interesting as the similarities, because of course they very sensibly both get better. They get over things, and he stays with his wife, and she marries Colonel Brandon and lives happily ever after, and so it's and what I've done, obviously it's quite a complicated argument in the book, that there's something about the poem is from the 1720s. It's very much the sort of melodramatic time of that time. Then the setting is from 1780s, I think, the Tommaso Giordani's setting of the poem, and then that kind of seems to mediate, because the musical language is almost more like Austen than the poetry is, and it kind of mediates that transition. But it's a funny sort of argument, and it's not saying anything about an influence really. It's just it's an observation.
An observation.
Yeah.
So here's a question about Irish songs.
Yeah. There's that's Frank Churchill being very naughty, of course. Yeah. Encouraging Emma to in his he is just, oh dear. So he's saying, because he bought this music, he bought the Irish melodies to come with the piano, and he bought the piano, and he's saying, oh look, here's a piano, oh look, here's the Irish melodies, and then he says she's playing Robin Adair, which is of course another Irish song, all about a woman who's been abandoned by her lover. And so there's a few things have been written about the Robin Adair, the allusions to Robin Adair in Emma, and it's a very interesting study of the way she sort of slyly alludes to things that really, so much. You just need to you need just a paragraph, and you can dig for hours and find new things in it. Yeah.
That's great.
I do have another question about Emma. When Frank Churchill starts singing while Emma is playing the piano, I'm interested to know what would have been the social reception of that kind of an act, because my memory of the scene is that Emma is in no way expecting this to happen, but he just joined the song, and this is part of the dramatic tension. What might that have meant to Austen's readers who were more familiar with these musical settings?
Yeah, that's really interesting. She's there's no sort of implication at the time that she's offended by it, or it's what is it, softly but correctly taken, and he excuses himself, and she says, it's wonderful, but So it shows that he's musical, and there's there's an article I've written called "Of Men and Music," which is about really how the musical men in the novels are the unreliable ones. If they can actually make out a tune on the piano, Captain Wentworth tries, but he's not very good at it.
Mm-hmm.
All the other heroes are unmusical. They're good at listening to music, but they're not so good at at playing themselves. Whereas Willoughby is a musician, and Frank Churchill and Henry Crawford isn't actually a musician, but he's almost tantamount to a musician. He's an artistic sort of man. So it's just it's a bit of fun, really, to think about that.
We did post in the chat, everyone, a link to Gillian's article, Music in Class in Jane Austen, where some of this argument about Willoughby and Frank Churchill, these men who are a bit suspect, whereas the other figures like Darcy, who's good at listening and appreciating, right? There's a kind of distinction in the character.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So y'all, I'm afraid to say that it is 8:25. We are suddenly out of time. Gillian, I want to thank you so very much for being with us this evening for this wonderful presentation. Really, really moving to hear the music. And thank you to everyone in our audience. Thank you for joining us. If you can, please stick around as we have more news to share from Jane Austen and Company. I now want to turn things over to Delicia, who will share some information about our upcoming events.
Our next event will take place on March 20th, when we'll hear from Catherine Libin in her talk on women and education in the Regency era. Just a reminder, the recording of tonight's presentation will be posted to our website, janeaustenandco.org, and to YouTube very soon after we finish tonight. If you can't wait until our next event, you can view any of our previous programs on the website, which contains the archive of all our previous lectures, over 40 of them, on topics ranging from Austen's daily musical practice and music books to the work of Regency textile designer Anna Maria Garthwaite, to multicultural adaptations of Jane Austen's novels. We have enjoyed bringing you this thought-provoking programming for the past 5 years.
So we thank you so much for attending tonight's presentation, and thank you to Gillian, especially, for a delightful talk. It was wonderful. And we didn't say there are a lot of wonderful applauding accolades and listening to the music and hearing your talk. So if you are still in the audience, please consider donating, and every contribution helps us to continue to provide new Austen-related content. So we will bid you all adieu. Thank you again, Gillian, and good night, everybody.
Thanks so much. See you.